and it's a topic that might surprise you. We're going to explore the history of violent racism in Britain and how it became such a significant issue.
It's a fascinating and complex story, one that goes back further than many people realize.
That's right. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions out there. For instance, a lot of people assume that violent racism in Britain is a relatively recent phenomenon tied to post-World War II immigration.
Right, that seems to be the common narrative. But the truth is, it's much more deeply rooted in British history. We're talking centuries, not just decades.
So are you saying that people of color have been a part of Britain for a long time, not just a recent arrival?
Absolutely. You can trace their presence back at least 1,000 years. Imagine during the Middle Ages, you had people of color working as merchants, soldiers, sailors, craftspeople. They were integrated into the fabric of British society.
Wow, that's amazing. So if they've been there for so long, what were the early attitudes toward them? Was it purely hostile, or was there a more nuanced relationship?
Well, it was definitely a mixed bag. You see instances of both acceptance and violence. For example, there are records of Black people owning land, marrying into local families, even holding positions of authority.
Really? So there was a level of integration and acceptance.
Yes, but on the flip side, you also have incidents of violence and prejudice. Take, for instance, the murder of a sailor in 1596 just because of his race. A mob in London attacked him. Can you believe that?
That's awful. It really challenges the idea that racism is purely a modern issue, doesn't it?
Exactly. These tensions have been simmering beneath the surface for centuries. And as we move into the 20th century, things get even more complex.
Okay, so let's talk about the 20th century then. When do we start to see a real surge in these violent racist incidents?
Well, the early 1900s, particularly around 1919, were a turning point.
1919. What was happening then that could have fueled that?
Well, think about the context. World War I had just ended. Soldiers were returning home, and there was intense competition for jobs and housing. And sadly, some people turned their frustrations and anxieties on minority communities.
So it was a time of economic and social upheaval, and some people looked for scapegoats.
Sadly, that's a pattern we see throughout history. And these weren't just isolated incidents either. There were full-blown anti-Black riots in several British cities. One particularly horrifying example is the case of Charles Wooten in Liverpool in 1919.
Charles Wooten. What happened to him?
There are accounts of him being chased by a mob, stoned, and ultimately left for dead. It really highlights the brutal reality of racism long before the post-war period.
That's terrible. So even before the influx of immigrants after World War II, there was already a significant undercurrent of racial tension.
Absolutely. And these incidents, like the Charles Wooten case, were not anomalies. They were indicative of a deeper problem that was only going to become more pronounced in the decades to come.
So we've already debunked the myth that violent racism only emerged after World War II. But let's talk about that post-war period now. We know there was a significant influx of immigrants from former colonies. How did that change the landscape?
It was a game changer, really. After the war, Britain needed to rebuild, and there was a shortage of labor. So the government actively encouraged immigration from Commonwealth countries.
Right, and that was codified in the 1948 British Nationality Act, right?
Exactly. That act granted the right to settle in Britain to anyone from a Commonwealth country. And while it was intended to strengthen ties and address some of the injustices of colonialism, it also had unintended consequences.
So this act, while aiming to right some past wrongs, also inadvertently fueled existing anxieties and tensions.
It's a complex issue. On one hand, it was a step towards acknowledging the contributions of people from former colonies. On the other hand, it coincided with a period of economic uncertainty and social change. And some people saw these newcomers as a threat. They blamed them for job shortages, housing problems, and a perceived erosion of British culture.
So you had this mix of economic anxieties, social fears, and a dose of good old-fashioned prejudice.
Exactly. And these sentiments were often exploited by politicians and media outlets, further inflaming tensions. We see this pattern repeating throughout history.
It's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, especially when they intersect with deep-seated prejudices. So we have this backdrop of economic change, social anxieties, and the significant influx of immigrants. Were there any particular incidents that brought these simmering tensions to a boil?
Yes, absolutely. The late 1950s marked a turning point, with a series of violent events that forced the issue of race and immigration onto the national stage. And one of the most notorious of these was the Notting Hill riots of 1958.
Ah, Notting Hill. Those riots are infamous, but refresh my memory on the specifics. What exactly happened?
Well, picture this. It's the summer of 1958 in London. Notting Hill at the time was a neighborhood with a growing Caribbean community. Tensions had been building for months, fueled by prejudice, rumors, and a sense of competition for resources.
So it was a powder keg waiting to explode.
Exactly, and all it took was a spark. One night, a fight broke out between a white woman and her black husband.
And that single incident ignited the riots.
Yes, it quickly escalated into days of rioting. Mobs attacked homes and businesses owned by black residents, fueled by racial hatred and a sense of mob mentality.
It's incredible how quickly things can spiral out of control. What role did the media play in shaping public perception of these events?
The media played a significant role. Some outlets sensationalized the violence, further inflaming tensions and reinforcing existing stereotypes.
So did the Notting Hill riots serve as a wake-up call, forcing British society to finally confront the issue of racism?
They did, in a way. The violence was so shocking that it could no longer be ignored, but they also exposed deep divisions within society. Some saw the riots as a horrific aberration, while others saw them as confirmation of their worst fears about immigration. And for many in the black community, it was a terrifying reminder of the dangers they faced daily.
So, a complex and troubling event with lasting consequences. And I'm guessing this is just the beginning of the story, right?
You're absolutely right. The Notting Hill riots were a turning point, but they didn't solve anything. They marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where race and immigration would become even more central to the British political landscape.
Okay, so we've set the stage, explored the historical roots, and witnessed the eruption of violence in Notting Hill. Now, things are about to get really interesting. In part 2 of this deep dive, we'll delve into the political landscape that emerged in the wake of these events. We'll explore how figures like Enoch Powell shaped the debate and how the fight against racism began to take on new forms. Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time, we left off with the Notting Hill riots. Seems like a turning point in British history.
It definitely was a pivotal moment. It forced British society to confront the fact that racism wasn't just a fringe issue.
Right. It was deeply embedded in society. So how did things evolve after that? Did the government take any action?
Well, the 1960s, was a decade of intense political debate about race and immigration. The Conservative Party, they were in power at the time, and they faced a lot of pressure to address the issue.
So they were kind of caught in the middle.
Exactly. They had to balance the concerns of those who felt threatened by immigration with the need to promote social cohesion. It was a delicate balancing act.
So what specific steps did they take?
Well, on one hand, they introduced stricter immigration controls, which appealed to those who saw immigration as a problem.
So playing to those fears.
In a way, yes. But on the other hand, they also recognized the need to address discrimination. And this led to the Race Relations Act of 1965.
The Race Relations Act. Tell me more about that.
It was a landmark piece of legislation. It outlawed discrimination on the grounds of race in public places. So, things like hotels, restaurants, and pubs.
Okay, so a step towards equality. But did it actually work? Did it change people's attitudes?
Well, that's the tricky part. You can pass laws, but changing hearts and minds is a much slower process.
Right, it's not a magic bullet.
Exactly. And meanwhile, groups like the National Front, who we talked about earlier, they saw this legislation as an attack on their vision of Britain.
So they doubled down on their rhetoric.
Absolutely. They exploited anxieties about immigration, claiming it was eroding British culture and identity.
It seems like they were capitalizing on those fears and uncertainty.
That's right. And this brings us to a pivotal figure in this whole story. Enoch Powell.
Enoch Powell. His name is still synonymous with controversy even today. What was it about him that made him such a polarizing figure?
Well, in 1968, he gave this infamous speech, the Rivers of Blood speech. It's considered one of the most controversial speeches in British political history.
What did he say in this speech that was so inflammatory?
He basically argued that continued immigration from Commonwealth countries would lead to racial conflict and violence in Britain. He used very vivid language, predicting a future where the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
Wow, that's strong language. It must have caused a huge uproar.
Oh, it did. It sparked protests and counter-protests, divided public opinion, and even led to some violence. Powell was actually dismissed from his position in the shadow cabinet because of the speech.
So even his own party condemned his views.
They did. But despite the backlash, his speech resonated with a segment of the population, particularly those who felt anxious about social change and economic uncertainty.
So he gave a voice to those anxieties, even if it was a divisive and harmful voice.
Yes, and his words, They had a lasting impact. They helped to legitimize racist views and embolden far-right groups like the National Front.
So, while Powell might have been censured by the political establishment, his ideas continued to circulate and influence the debate.
Exactly. It's a reminder that words have power and that even when condemned, they can still have a profound impact on society.
It's a sobering thought. So we have this backdrop of rising tensions, stricter immigration controls, and the emergence of figures like Enoch Powell. How did the fight against racism evolve during this period? Did it gain any momentum?
Yes, despite the challenges, the anti-racism movement was gaining strength. Organizations like the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARID, were formed, and they were organizing protests, advocating for equal rights, and providing support to victims of racial discrimination.
So a growing movement pushing back against these racist ideologies.
Exactly. And this activism, it started to make a difference. It helped to raise awareness, challenge racist stereotypes, and push for change.
It sounds like a real battle for hearts and minds was taking place.
It definitely was. And this fight played out in communities, in the media, and in parliament, and it wasn't always peaceful. There were violent clashes between anti-racist groups and far-right organizations.
The things were getting more heated, more polarized.
Yes, and this brings us to another tragic event, the murder of Altab Ali in 1978.
Altab Ali, tell me about him.
He was a young Bengali man who was attacked and killed by a group of racist youths in East London. His death sparked outrage and led to a huge anti-racist demonstration in London.
So another senseless act of violence. It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear. Were there any other significant developments during this period?
Well, the rise of the skinhead subculture is also worth noting.
Skinheads. I know they're often associated with racism, but how did that connection come about?
It's a complicated story. The skinhead movement, it originated in working class communities in the 1960s. And it was initially about a sense of pride, community, and rebellion against the establishment.
So it wasn't inherently racist.
No, not at all. But as the far right gained influence, they saw an opportunity. They started infiltrating skinhead groups, promoting their racist ideology, and encouraging violence against immigrants and minorities.
So they kind of hijacked the movement.
Exactly. It's a tragic example of how extremist groups can exploit existing anxieties and frustrations for their own agenda.
It seems like this period was a constant push and pull between those fighting for equality and those clinging to prejudice. Were there any signs that things were moving in the right direction?
Well, despite the challenges, there were definitely glimmers of hope. The anti-racism movement was growing stronger, forcing the issue of race onto the national agenda. And even the government, under Margaret Thatcher, they started to acknowledge the need to address racial inequality, albeit within a framework of individual responsibility.
So a mixed bag of progress and setbacks.
That's a good way to put it. It's important to remember that history isn't a neat and tidy narrative. It's messy, it's complex, and there are often competing forces at play.
And that complexity is what makes it so fascinating to study, right? It's not just about dates and events, but about understanding the human stories behind them.
Absolutely, and it's by understanding the past that we can hopefully learn from it and shape a better future.
Well said. Okay, so we've explored this turbulent period, witnessing both progress and setbacks in the fight against racism. In the final part of this deep dive, we'll delve into the lasting impact of these historical events and consider the challenges that remain in building a truly just and equitable society. Welcome back to our deep dive into violent racism in Britain. So, we've traced this complex history, from those early encounters to the political battles of the 20th century. But where does that leave us today? What's the lasting impact of all of this?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that progress has been made. We have legislation, like the Equality Act, that prohibits discrimination, and there's a greater awareness of these issues now.
Right, but has that translated into real change? Do minority communities in Britain truly experience equality today?
That's a tough question. While there's been progress, those deep-seated inequalities, they haven't vanished. Minority communities still face discrimination in housing, employment, and education.
So it's not just about overt acts of racism anymore. It's about these systemic barriers.
Exactly. We have to look beyond those individual incidents and understand how these historical patterns of prejudice continue to shape society today.
So it's about tackling those underlying structures
Yeah.
that perpetuate inequality. But how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, for one, we have to acknowledge that racism is not just a problem of the past. It's still very much present in our society.
Right. It's not something that just magically disappeared.
Exactly. And we need to continue challenging those racist attitudes and behaviors wherever we encounter them.
So it's about speaking out, calling it out when we see it.
Absolutely. And it's also about education. We need to teach our children about the history of racism and the importance of equality and inclusion.
Right. Starting young is crucial.
Yeah.
But it feels like we're constantly battling against these resurgences of prejudice. It's like a never-ending cycle.
You're right. It can feel that way sometimes. Events like 9/11, the Brexit referendum, they often trigger those spikes in Islamophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. It's like those anxieties and prejudices are always lurking beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to resurface.
So it's almost like a pendulum swing.
In a way, yes. And it's often fueled by political rhetoric, scapegoating certain groups to divert attention from other problems.
That's a disturbing pattern. So if we're always at risk of these resurgences, what can we do to break this cycle? How do we create a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone?
Well, it's a complex challenge, but I think there are a few key things. First, we need to continue to have honest and open conversations about race and racism. We can't
Yeah.
just sweep these issues under the rug.
Right. Open dialogue is essential. What else?
Second, we need to challenge those structural inequalities. That means addressing things like poverty, lack of access to education and healthcare, and discrimination in the criminal justice system.
So it's about tackling those root causes of inequality.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's about fostering a sense of empathy and understanding. We need to recognize our shared humanity and celebrate our differences.
Building bridges, breaking down those walls of prejudice.
Precisely. It's a long and ongoing process, but I believe it's a fight worth having.
Well said. It's clear that the fight for racial equality is far from over. And it's a fight that requires all of us to be engaged, to be informed, and to be active participants in creating a more just and equitable society. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope it sparks some reflection and perhaps even some action. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.